Hey, and welcome. My name is Dave Geddes. This is a brand new series where you and I are going to level up our UI chops. We're going to build a lot of awesome layouts together. This first one is from the game Overwatch. The other day I was playing Overwatch, and while waiting for a match to start, I was just sitting there admiring this cool hero picker UI. So it got me thinking, I wonder how hard it'd be to build this thing with CSS. So why the heck not? Let's give it a shot. So we're going to build this UI from scratch, but to get the best experience, you'll probably want to follow along using the Git repository I've set up that has some of these assets to work with, and the repository also has some checkpoints as branches, so if you ever get stuck, you can easily get caught up again by changing to the right branch. Go ahead and clone the Overwatch Hero Picker Git repo. That's over on github.com/gedski/Overwatch Hero Picker. So once you're there, hit this clone or download button, copy the link, and in your terminal, do git clone and paste it. That's going to pull down the repo. It's going to take a minute because there's a big video that we use as a reference. You'll see. So once that's done, you can switch into that directory and take a look. Okay, let's open this up in an editor. You can use whichever tool you like. I like VS Code. So I'm going to launch that, and let's see what we've got. Okay, so to start, we have an index.html that is empty, overwatch.css file that is empty, some images of some of our heroes, and a font that looks kind of like the Overwatch font, and an assets.css. I've done some work here for you that's maybe a little bit tedious, just linking CSS classes to these pictures. The other thing you're going to want to get is Firefox Nightly. Normally I use Chrome for development, but Firefox has some amazing tools for CSS Grid right now that no other browsers are even close. So we're going to use Firefox Nightly. You can get it on their website. It's called Nightly because you get a new version of it every couple of weeks. Just kidding. Wow. Tough crowd. Okay, so once you have Firefox Nightly, let's go to our index.html and start creating some markup. So I use Emmet for this little shortcut because, yeah, I don't want to remember all that stuff. I'm just going to give it a title, Overwatch Hero Picker. Hey, yo. Okay, once you've got your HTML file created, I'm also just going to hide all this stuff so that you can see it a little better. There we go. Okay, we're also going to want a way to be able to preview our changes really fast without having to hit refresh all the time. There's a bunch of ways you can do this. If you're using like Webpack in a real app, then you can have hot module replacement, which is pretty cool. For this project, though, we're just going to use a tool called Browser Sync. So the way you get it is through npm install browser-sync and do it globally. Now I've already installed it, so I'm not going to do it. But once you've done this, browser sync's cool because then you can just start a server anywhere. So browser sync start -- server and then -- files star. That tells it to watch all the files for changes, and anytime there's a change, it will refresh all the connected browsers for you. A couple other options I like to use are no notify, so it doesn't have that little pop-up, and no open, so it won't open my default browser, which is currently Chrome. Okay, so go ahead and launch that, and then copy the link it gives you, paste it into Firefox Nightly. There it is. Let's just double check that it worked. Awesome. Let's link up our CSS files. Overwatch.css, and the other one was assets.css. Let's also open the overwatch.css file, and if you can split screen it in your editor, then that will be helpful. Now let's add a couple of styles to the body tag, just to make it easier to work with. No margin, and we're going to do overflow hidden, just because the Firefox Nightly grid tool adds a whole bunch of scroll bars for no reason. It's probably a bug. We don't need it, so we'll take it off for now. The other initial style I always like to have is on every descendant of the body, box sizing, border box. This just makes it so if you have an element and you add padding or a border to it, that element's not going to take up any more space than what you already specified. So it's just a saner way to live. Now, if you clone the Git repository, you'll notice there's a reference directory in there that has a Overwatch video in it. So we're going to actually put that video right onto our page so we can see it as we build it. So let's add a video element where the source is reference overwatch.mp4. All right, hit save, and there it is. Now it's a little bit big, so for the sake of this video, I'm going to shrink it. So I recommend you do the same. Down in your CSS, we'll just do video, height. Let's go with 600 pixels. See how that looks. That leaves us just enough room to see the dev tools. Right click, inspect element. That brings up the dev tools, and then just go ahead and resize this. Et voila. A couple more tricks with this video. We actually don't want it to take up room in the DOM because we're going to be building stuff here. So we're going to make it position absolute. Let's also change the opacity to something like 0.5, just so we can see our stuff on top of this a little bit better. Okay, one last trick with this video is we could add controls and then play this if we want and scrub to the right spot. That works, but even better, get rid of controls and add pound t equals. That's for time. So we could do 52 seconds, hit save, and that's going to scrub the video to where we want. 12 seconds. Okay. 62 sounds good. Let's leave it right there for a minute. That shows our screen that we're going to be building and has the best character in the game pre-selected for us. That's a good checkpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and commit all this stuff, as well as create a branch called setup. Oh, by the way, those are just shortcuts that I have set up for Git. So that was actually like Git branch setup. So if you take a look at the Git branches, we now have one called setup. So if you're following along, but you got lazy, then you can fast forward by doing a Git checkout setup. Now, before we start building this, let's take a second to kind of plan how we're going to do the markup and some of the layout. Now, we're going to use CSS Grid for this layout. And one thing we could do is give every single one of these heroes their own column and just have one big grid for the entire page. Now, sometimes that's great. When everything lines up in a grid, that's definitely the way to go. But in this case, things just don't line up with one single grid. For example, these selected heroes up here seem to have their own grid. So if you tried to do it all on one big grid, you could probably make it work with some hacks, but it wouldn't be very fun. So I think what we'll do instead is define a 1x5 grid to kind of contain these groups as I'm drawing them here. And then within each group, we can either use Flexbox or grids depending on which one is the better fit. Let's go ahead and create our div to hold this whole grid. We'll call it container, and let's give it a CSS class. Just for the sake of this video, let's make it have a fixed height of 600 pixels. You can make it responsive, obviously, but for now, for this one, we'll just keep it simple. Let's do width 100%. Let's make sure it worked. Beautiful. Okay, let's turn this thing into a grid. Are you ready? Display grid. As soon as you do that, there is a new tool for you in the dev tools. So within the inspector tab, go switch from rules to layout. This is going to list all of the grids that we have in our app. Right now we just have one, and it's our container. But there's nothing there yet because we haven't really defined it yet. So we said it was going to be a 1x5 grid. So let's do that. Let's start with our one column. Okay, so using the grid template columns property, we can define all of the columns that are going to be in this grid. In this case, we're just going to have one column, and we want it to be at the full width. So we could either do 100% or 1FR. That's the new fraction unit. This basically says take up the full part when there's only one column. So let's save it. Nothing shows up yet because we don't have any rows. Let's make some rows. Now, just like grid template columns, grid template rows takes a space separated list of values. So we could do like 200 pixels, 300 pixels, 200 pixels to define 3 rows in our grid. Now I saved it and nothing showed up yet because we haven't enabled the dev tool to show it. So see this little checkbox? You got to click that. As soon as we do that, you'll notice it painted our rows and our single column. Now we can make this visualization even better by turning on display line numbers. So that's going to show us the different lines in our grid, 1, 2, and 3. There's a couple other options, but we don't really need those quite yet, so we'll come back to them. Let's make our grid rows be the right heights. So I'm going to get out my measuring tool. I use Xscope. It's pretty decent. Using this, I can see we've got 600 pixels. I really want this first row to be somewhere around about 268. As long as it doesn't cut off that 17. So that should work. So let's change this one to 268. Awesome. See how it painted the line to match? The next row, I really just want to capture that 17. So I'm going to go right to the end of it at about 39. That looks pretty good. Change this to 39. Awesome. Okay, going down to this next group where the heroes are selected. Let's do about 140. I'm going to go down a little bit past where these are because I want to use some centering for these other parts you'll see. So I'm going to do 140 on this next part for this next row. And we are all out of rows, but no problem. We can add new ones. For the hero picking row, I mentioned I wanted it to be centered, so I'm going to do about 83 pixels. That'll just make it easy to center these guys. Okay, just like that, it added a new row for us. This last row, we don't really need to measure it because I can just say use up one fraction of the remaining space. And that's why the FR unit is pretty cool. You can combine it with other units. We could have done this entire thing as fractions, and that would have worked too. In fact, that would have been great for making this a responsive one, but for now, we're just going to do pixels. Okay, looking good. We have one column and 5 rows. Now, we can use another kind of cool thing by naming the areas in our grid. So I'm going to use grid template areas to name these. So that top section, I'm just going to call it top. And then for the countdown for the game to start, we'll just call it countdown. And then for the heroes that people have picked, we'll call that selections. For the options, the heroes that people can pick, we'll call that heroes. And then for the select button area, we'll just call it select. You don't have to name your areas and grids, but if you do, you can put content into it regardless of where that content is in the DOM, which is pretty neat. Let's start putting stuff inside of our grid. Why don't we begin with this selected hero area? So inside of our container, let's add a div with a class of selections. Now watch this. This is cool. I'm going to add a class for the selections. Give it a background color so we can see it. And by default, the browser puts this first item into the first row of our grid. That's just how it's going to start to fill it out from top to bottom. But if we don't want selections to be the first row, we can tell it to go in a specific area with grid area. And we happen to have an area called selections. Check that out. So even though it's the first item in the DOM in our grid, we said, hey, put this div into this area of our grid, which is pretty sweet. Now let's build one of these selections. So I'm looking at Lucosa here, having picked Bastion. So it looks like we need to display the hero, this kind of background image, the name of the player, and this little player drop down. Easy peasy. Let's build it. We'll just call it a selection. And inside of the selection, we'll have the hero. Then why don't we make a div called info to contain both the player name and that drop down. And let's do that drop down. Hero drop down. So this selections area, we know it's a row in our main grid, but there's no reason why it can't be a grid itself. So let's do that. Let's turn it into a grid. We want 6 columns to fit those 6 selections. So let's do grid template columns. Now there's another shortcut when you're defining a bunch of columns that are all the same. You can use repeat. So I want 6 columns. And if we did 100 pixels, that's going to create 6 columns that are each 100 pixels wide. And if we come over here in the DevTools, we can now switch to visualize that grid instead. Check it out, 6 columns. That purple is kind of hard to see, so I'm going to change it to blue. Okay, now 100 pixels wide isn't what we need for these guys, so let's get a measurement out. And I'm going to measure some of these wider ones that have that hero image. It looks like maybe around 77 would do it. Okay, so let's change our column to 77. Now you'll notice that everything is squished over to the left and our heroes are centered. So we can center stuff with grids easily. In fact, it's just like Flexbox. Justify content, center. Almost there. Our columns aren't quite lining up with the heroes yet because there's actually a gap in between all of the heroes. So between Winston and Widowmaker, there's about a 30 pixel gap. So let's add that to our column. So grids is actually pretty sweet in that you can just add grid column gap 29 pixels, and that's going to add a nice perfect gap just on the inside spaces of our columns and not on the outer edges. So no more of that first child, last child styling exceptions that we used to have to do. And it looks like we line them up pretty good. Let's style this selection now. Poor Lucosa isn't looking too great. All right, so selection. First off, let's get that portrait kind of background. I have one included in the assets, so let's use it. Yay, there it is. It's a little bit too big, which is fine. We'll just change the size. Okay, not bad. Looks like we need to push it down just a little bit. How's that? It looks about right. Okay. Oh, that's supposed to be assets.css. And then let's add the attribute of hero equals Bastion so that this div gets linked to our Bastion picture. Okay, let's style these heroes now. First thing we're going to do is make it have a width of 100% and height of about 96 pixels. No repeat on the background. And then these images are a little bit too big, so we're going to make them about 70%. Okay, it looks like our hero's in the right spot. I want to see the video for a second though. Let's change the opacity back to 1 and take a look at this behavior we've got. So you'll notice these heroes, they get kind of cropped by this border, but then they come out of the border. Kind of makes them look like they're coming through that thing, which is pretty neat effect. Now we can do that pretty easily with CSS. I'm going to change this back to 0.5. Actually, I'm going to make it 0 so we can just see our own thing for a second. Notice our hero, he's coming out through the top just fine and through the sides, but he's not getting clipped. So we're going to actually use CSS clip path to crop him out. Let's make our hero a little bit opaque for a second, just so we can see that border a lot better. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is take a screenshot. We'll capture our little Bastion guy here. Now when working with clip path, it can be a little bit of a pain to use. So there's actually a tool I like to use by this Bennett Freely guy. And if you go to his site, this Clippy tool, you can paste in a link to an image. So here's the screenshot we just took. And you can set the dimensions to match. And then using this tool, you can actually just draw the clip path that you want to use, which is way more convenient. So I'm going to start with this shape. It's got a lot of points to work with. Drag that one to the corners. We don't really need this middle one. We want to just kind of capture that frame where things are going to clip. So I'm going to go to the sides, maybe up a little bit, and then straight out to the side. We'll do the same thing on the other side. About like that. Doesn't have to be perfect. And then at the end, I can copy the output and paste it over in my hero. Now take a look at him. Without it, he's not clipped. With it, he is clipped. Sweet. All right, let's make our video visible again. And why don't we do next this font, this name, and the little drop down. So this is a pretty cool font. I found someone who reverse engineered it and made a new font. So let's add that to our CSS. Okay, so it'll be a custom font face. We're going to name it Font Family Overwatch and link it to the font that I've included in the assets. It's called Big Noodle 2. Okay, so once we've defined that font, we can use it. So let's use it on selection name. Font family Overwatch. Hey, and it looks like it's stylized. Italic. Good. Okay, let's make this a little bit bigger. 18 pixels is about right. Looks like we need to push it down a tiny bit. So we'll do margin bottom on the hero. Okay, now let's grab that color. I'm going to just inspect that video and open the video in a new tab, just so I don't have to keep changing opacity. I'll grab my color picker and try to grab that blue. Okay. Copy that. Go back and put this as our color for the name. There we go. Let's take a look at it. Looks good. All right. Let's make this video just a little bit less opaque so we can see our own stuff a tiny bit better. And let's start working on that drop down. Okay, it's about 11 pixels wide, 11 tall. And just so we can see it, let's give it a background of red for a second. Okay, because they're two divs, it is dropped down to the line below. But we have this info div that we're going to make a flex container. So we'll do display flex on it. Now they're lined up in the same row. Line these horizontally with align items center, and then add just a bit of padding to the left. And that should line it up just right. Let's check it out. Sweet. Let's work on that hero drop down now. Get rid of the background. Give it a border of 1 pixel purple just so we can see it. And let's round that out with the border radius. 9 pixels should do it. Okay, now that hero drop down has the little part in the middle. So we're going to use after pseudo selector and add some content of that caret. Let's make it purple just so we can see it a little bit better. And let's make it have the same font of Overwatch. Now it's not quite centered, so let's make our drop down a flex container, display flex, and then we will center things with justify content, and then flip it with transform scale in the y-axis of -1. That should flip it perfectly for us. Now let's just make it white to match. Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and add some HTML for the rest of these heroes. Please don't feel like you have to type all these out like some kind of animal. What I'll do is create a Git branch here, and you can fast forward to it. But let's check it out. Beautiful. Okay, the only problem though is that some of our titles aren't quite lining up. It's because we used 9 pixel padding, which worked great for this first one, but didn't work for the others necessarily. So let's find that info class, get rid of the padding, and instead let's just center it with Flexbox. Close enough. So if you're following along and you don't want to type all that, but you want to be up to date, you can just do a git checkout selections branch. Next up, let's build these hero options down here below. Drawing out these lines, it looks like this is a perfect place for another grid. So you can see we've got 4 columns with a little bit of space between them. So this shouldn't be too hard to do at all. Let's start by just collapsing these selections just to get them out of the way and adding a new div for the heroes. Okay, let's add a CSS class for the heroes. Give it a background so we can see it for a sec. And again, added it to the very top of our parent grid as the first item, but we want to place it down in the heroes area. Isn't that awesome? I love that. Let's also tell it to be a grid with display grid. And once we've done that, we can go over into the DevTools again and visualize our new grid. Of course, we don't have any columns yet, so let's do that. We know we want 4 columns. And these are each going to be different width columns, and I've already measured them ahead of time using Xscope, so I'm just going to put those in. So it is 241 pixels for the first one, 213 for the next one, 206, and then 177. Now, before we can visualize this, let's put some content in it. I'm just going to paste all the heroes and make it big enough so you can see. If you want to type that out, you're welcome to. Or you can just git checkout heroes prep. And now we can visualize our grid in the DevTools. So over here, select div.heroes And that orange is kind of hard to see, so I'm going to change it to red. Okay, so we have our columns, but they're not in the right spots. Let's fix that. We're going to add some padding to the left of this element. 75 pixels just to move it over so it lines up with Genji there. And then we need some gaps in between these columns. Looks pretty good. Okay, now that we've defined our columns, let's style the stuff that goes in them. So we have these categories for each type of hero: defense, attack, whatever. Then we have the hero option you can actually pick. So let's start with the option and give these guys a width, 30 pixels, height of 44, background so we can see them. Okay, they are going vertically. So let's actually make these categories a flex container. That's a little better. Let's center them with align items. Okay, getting closer. On these options, let's just give them a margin on the side. Of just a few pixels. Need just a little bit more. There we go. Now our background images are a little bit too big, so we can fix that with background size, cover. There we go. Okay, we've almost got it. Now, if you look at this video, see how they're kind of at an angle? We can easily do that with CSS. So we can actually just skew these a few degrees to match that. Nice. One other thing we should probably change is make the transform origin for these skews to be the bottom left so that they line up with our grid. That's better. Okay, what else are we missing for this? If we look at our video, it looks like the backgrounds are actually black, and we have this nice highlight on the top and the bottom. Shouldn't be a problem. So let's change that to black. And for the highlights, we can do those with box shadow. Okay, there's the top one. Let's do another one. For the bottom. Okay, pretty decent. Only thing we're missing now is a border radius. Let's compare that to our video. Nailed it. One last thing on these hero icons is they have kind of a cool hover effect that you can see. Watch this. See that? They kind of scale and have a full white border on them. So let's do that. So first thing we'll do is scale them. Let's see how that does. Okay, not bad. Because we're overriding the transform, we lose our skew, so we need to add that back in. Okay, that's better. Move it over a little bit. So that it looks like it's scaling from the center, despite our transform origin of the bottom left. Let's take a look at our video again and see what we're missing on this hover effect. Okay, looks like it has a solid border, and there's a little bit of a delay in that hover animation. So let's add both of those. Okay, for the border, we're using box shadow, so we can just make Instead of the top and bottom box shadow, let's just have one. And the syntax for this is offset to the left, which for us is going to be 0. Offset in the y-axis, again, it's going to be 0. And then the blur radius, we don't want a blur on it. And then the thickness or the spread radius, so we want 3 pixels. And finally, the color of white. Let's see how that looks. Okay, that looks good. Looks like we got a z-index problem though. So when we hover on one of these, we want them to show up on top. So z-index of 2 should do it. That's better. Okay, you'll notice these are instantly going. Let's add a slight delay. So we can do that with the transition duration. So if we did like 500 milliseconds, that'd be a pretty slow transition. Watch this. See that? We want a pretty quick one, so we'll just do 50 milliseconds. That's still too slow. Let's do like 25 milliseconds. There we go. That's better. That's good for this hero area. If you are following along and want to get caught up, you can just do git checkout heroes. All right, now let's do that select button down there. So let's add it to our DOM. I'm going to just collapse the heroes for now. Okay, we'll have a select div and then just a button that says select. Okay, let's add a CSS class for that. So we can see it show up. Again, added it to the top, but we're going to move it to the bottom, the select area. Also turn this row into a flex container. And center our button within it. Cool. Now let's style that button. Let's get rid of that hideous border on it. Let's push it down a little bit. And let's get the font size right. And the right font family. Looks like our letter spacing isn't quite matching though, so let's fix that. Close enough. Now let's just get that color. Remove this orange. Let's look at the video for our color. Now I believe it has a different color when you hover over it, so let's add that. Use the browser's built-in color picker. So let's select our button, and over in the rules tab we can see our background. If you select this little color icon, it lets you pick a different color. So I'll just slide that up a little bit to make it brighter. Copy that. Now let's just hide our video and let's see how our hover looks. Awesome. Let's add the video back in. And for the final piece we'll build today is this top game info part. So let's add some HTML for that. Looks like there's 2 parts to it. There's info about the match. And info about the character you've picked. Within the match, looks like we have a map and also a game type. The game type is going to be attack, and this map is King's Row. And our character, of course, is Bastion. Okay, let's style all of these. Let's make this whole thing a flex container. And we want to put them, each piece, on either side. So we can easily do that with justify content space between. Let's give a little bit of padding to this on both sides. And now we can just work on the fonts. Cool, looks good. Let's color that map. Sweet, looks good. Now let's do this other side. Looks good. Let's see how things look without our video now. Awesome, except that you can't see anything. So let's just give ourselves a different background. If you go back to the container element, we can add a background to this. Not bad, but we want it to show up, so let's do a background size of cover. Looking good. Let's turn off our grid inspector for a second and just admire our work. So we've created this entire Overwatch UI. We're missing a couple of things from the video, like this join team chat. I would probably use absolute positioning for that. Same with this button. A couple of little icons you could easily add if you want to go the extra mile on this. But for now, let's call it good. We've learned a lot. We've used grids, we've used Flexbox, and we've built a pretty cool UI. If you want to get really good at Flexbox, go check out flexboxzombies.com. This is a free story course that I've built where you shoot these zombies with a crossbow controlled by Flexbox. It's a lot of fun. And if you want to master CSS grid layout, go sign up for gridcritters.com. It's a story course I'm building right now where you have to master CSS grid in order to save an adorable alien life form from certain destruction. It's going to be a blast. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time.